What if I told you Ford built an engine so radical that Chrysler's engineers literally bought one just to tear it apart and figure out how they'd been beaten? An engine that dominated racing so completely, NASCAR had to change the rules just to stop it. An engine that, at its peak, was making 290 horsepower from just 351 cubic inches when the legendary 426 Hemi needed 75 more cubes to make 35 more horsepower. Picture this. It's May 1969, and Ford's engineers are in a conference room in Dearborn staring at sales charts that look like a ski slope, heading downhill. The total performance program that put Ford in victory lane was bleeding the company dry, $18 million a year just for NASCAR alone. The bean counters wanted out. But the engineers, they had one last card to play. A clean-sheet V8 design that would shock the automotive world. They called it the 335 series, but you know it as the 351 Cleveland. This is the story of Ford's most misunderstood engine, an absolute monster that arrived just as the muscle car era was dying, a technological tour de force that most people never understood, and a racing weapon so effective it got itself banned. The 351 Cleveland wasn't just another Ford V8. It was a purpose-built assassin wearing street clothes, and today I'm revealing 20 secrets about this engine that even die-hard Ford fans probably don't know. To understand why the Cleveland was revolutionary, we need to travel back to 1968. Ford's racing program was at its zenith. GT40s had just humiliated Ferrari at Le Mans for the third year straight. Ford-powered cars were winning in NASCAR, Trans-Am, drag racing, you name it. But there was a problem brewing in Dearborn. The Windsor small block, Ford's workhorse since 1962, was running out of breath. Sure, the Boss 302 was a screamer, but it took exotic parts and race gas to make real power. The 427 FE was a beast, but it was heavy, expensive, and thirsty enough to drain a gas station. Chevrolet had their Mark IV big block, and the small block was getting bigger. Mopar had the 440 and that legendary 426 Hemi. Ford needed something new, something that could run with the big blocks, but fit where a small block lived. Enter Bill Gay, Ford's chief engine engineer, and his team of absolute madmen in the Advanced Engine Development Group. These guys didn't just want to build another V8. They wanted to build the V8, the ultimate expression of pushrod technology, an engine that could make big block power from small block displacement. Their target? 400 horsepower from 351 cubic inches, naturally aspirated, on pump gas. In 1968, that was like saying you're going to build a smartphone in 1950. Here's where it gets interesting. The Cleveland wasn't actually designed in Cleveland. That name came from the engine plant where it would be built. Ford Engine Plant No. 2 in Brook Park, Ohio, right outside Cleveland. The design work happened in Dearborn, where Gay's team threw out the rulebook. First secret that'll blow your mind. The Cleveland's ports were bigger than a 426 Hemi's, not similar, bigger. The 4V Cleveland heads, and yes, that 4V stood for 4 Venturi, not 4-valve, had intake ports that measured 2.5 inches by 1.75 inches. The mighty Hemi, 2.25 by 1.95. The Cleveland moved more air than Chrysler's Elephant motor, and it did it with 75 fewer cubic inches. But here's the kicker. Those massive ports weren't just big for the sake of being big. Ford's engineers had discovered something revolutionary in their flow bench testing. They called it controlled turbulence. See, everyone else was trying to make ports as smooth as possible, polishing them to a mirror finish. Ford went the opposite direction. They deliberately designed texture and angles into the ports that created specific vortex patterns. This turbulence actually improved fuel atomization and cylinder filling at high RPM. The numbers speak for themselves. A stock 4V Cleveland head flowed 275 cubic feet per minute at 500 lift. A Chrysler Hemi head, 280 CFM. Ford was matching Chrysler's legendary hemispherical combustion chambers with a wedge design. How? Canted valves. The Cleveland's valves were tilted at different angles, intakes at 9.5 degrees, exhausts at 4.5 degrees, which created a quasi-hemispherical combustion chamber without the complexity and weight of a true Hemi head. But wait, there's more. Secret number 3. Ford built two completely different Cleveland heads, and most people never knew the difference. The 2V heads had smaller ports designed for street torque. The 4V heads were pure racing technology, barely disguised for the street. The difference was staggering. The 2V ports were 2.04 inches by 1.65 inches. Respectable. The 4V ports? Those monster 2.5 by 1.75-inch rectangles that could swallow a tennis ball. The 4V heads were so radical, Ford engineers privately called them toilet bowl ports because of their massive oval shape. These weren't adapted from existing designs. They were created using cutting-edge computer modeling in 1969. Ford had partnered with NASA contractors who were using early computational fluid dynamics for rocket engine design. That technology got applied to the Cleveland. Your muscle car had literal rocket science under the hood. Now here's secret number 4 that nobody talks about. The Cleveland block wasn't just strong, it was overbuilt to an insane degree. The main bearing webbing was thicker than a 427 FE big block. The cylinder walls were 125 inches thicker than a Chevy small block. Ford engineers designed this thing to handle 8,000 RPM and 700 horsepower right from the start. The production engines were detuned not because the bottom end couldn't take it, but because 1970s valve spring technology couldn't keep up with what the heads could flow. Speaking of the bottom end, here's where things get really interesting. The Cleveland stroke was identical to the Windsor, 3.50 inches, but the bore was bigger at 4 inches versus 3.68. This gave the Cleveland a better rod-to-stroke ratio of 1.65.1 versus the Windsor's 1.54.1. That meant less side loading on the cylinder walls, higher RPM capability, and better high RPM breathing. It was a race engine architecture disguised as a passenger car motor, but Ford's engineers weren't done. Secret number 5. The Cleveland had the most advanced oiling system Ford had ever designed for a production engine. While everyone else was using simple splash oiling with maybe some oil squirters, the Cleveland had a priority main oiling system with dedicated passages to the cam bearings, timed oil squirters for the cylinder walls, and something nobody else had, hydraulic valve lash adjusters fed by dedicated oil galleries through the heads. The oiling system was so sophisticated it actually became a problem. The passages were sized for racing, where thick oil and high pressure were the norm. On the street, with thin 10W30 oil, the Cleveland could actually pump too much oil to the top end and starve the bottom end. Ford had to issue technical service bulletins telling mechanics to install oil restrictors in the heads. It was literally too good at oiling for street use. Let's talk about the camshaft for a moment. Secret number 6. The Cleveland cam was mounted higher in the block than any other Ford V8. This reduced pushrod length and angle, which meant more stable valve train at high RPM, but it also meant the Cleveland needed its own unique timing chain and gears. You couldn't swap parts with a Windsor or FE. This engine was its own ecosystem. The hydraulic cam that came in the Boss 351 and early Cobra Jet engines was borderline psychotic for a street engine. It had 0.491-inch intake lift and 500-inch exhaust lift with 275 degrees of duration. For comparison, the Boss 302's solid lifter cam had 477 lift. Ford was running more lift with hydraulic lifters than their race engines had with solid lifters just 2 years earlier. The valve springs were wound so tight they'd occasionally break rocker arm studs on money shifts. Secret number 7 is my favorite. Ford built 3 different Cleveland cranks, and each told a different story. The standard cast crank was good for 5,500 RPM and 400 horsepower. The nodular iron crank that came in some Cobra jets could handle 6,500 RPM and 500 horsepower. But the forged steel crank that went into Boss 351s and some special order engines? That piece was identical to what Ford ran in Can-Am racing. It was tested to 9,000 RPM and 700 horsepower in a street car in 1971. The connecting rods were equally overbuilt. The standard rods were shot-peened and magnafluxed from the factory. Racing prep on a production engine. The Boss 351 got forged rods that were weight-matched to within 2 grams. NASCAR teams running Cleveland's discovered they could run the stock rods up to 8,500 RPM without failure. Try that with a Chevy pink rod. I'll wait. Now, let's dive deep into those legendary heads. Secret number 8. The Cleveland 4V heads were too good for the street. I'm not exaggerating. The ports were so large that at street RPM, under $3,000, the air velocity was too slow for proper fuel atomization. The engine would actually run rough and get terrible gas mileage until you hit about 3,500 RPM. Then it was like someone lit the afterburner. Ford knew this. Internal documents from 1970 show engineers debating whether to even release the 4V heads for street use. The compromise? They created the 351 CJ with special pistons that had a dome to increase compression and improve low RPM response. Even then, the engine was marginal below 2,500 RPM. Magazine tests from 1970 noted that the 351 CJ Mustang was actually slower from 0-30 mph than the 351 2V version. But from 30 to 100, it was a rocket ship. Secret number 9 will shock even Ford experts. In 1970, Ford built exactly 96 engines with a special code, 351HO. These weren't the later emissions-strangled 351HOs from 1972. These were special order racing homologation engines that made it into lucky customer cars. They had the Boss 351 cam, forged pistons, 4-bolt mains, and a dual-point distributor. Rated at 330 horsepower, they actually dynoed at 385. Ford built them to qualify the parts for Trans-Am racing, but had to sell some to the public to make it legal. Today, finding one of these engines is like finding a Rembrandt at a garage sale. The Boss 351 itself, secret number 10, was underrated by 50 horsepower. Ford claimed 330 horsepower at 5,400 RPM. Independent dyno testing by Hot Rod Magazine showed 380 at 6,000 RPM. With just headers and tuning, they got 425 horsepower. This was from a completely stock engine with hydraulic lifters and a single 4-barrel carburetor. The L88 Corvette, with solid lifters and race gas requirement, made 430. The Boss did 425 on pump gas. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Secret number 11. Ford's Trans-Am program with the Cleveland was so dominant, it killed Trans-Am racing. In 1970, Parnelli Jones won the championship in a Bud Moore Boss 302 Mustang. For 1971, Moore's team switched to the Cleveland. The results were devastating. The race-prepped Cleveland made 470 horsepower at 7,800 RPM from just 305 cubic inches. Trans-Am rules limited displacement. That's 1.54 horsepower per cubic inch, naturally aspirated, on gasoline in 1971. For perspective, a modern NASCAR engine makes about 1.75 horsepower per cubic inch with 40 years more development and technology that didn't exist in 1971. Moore's Mustangs with George Follmer and Parnelli Jones destroyed the competition so thoroughly that Chrysler and AMC withdrew from Trans-Am. Chevrolet threatened to leave. Track attendance plummeted because the races became Ford parades. The SCCA changed the rules for 1972, effectively banning the Cleveland's design advantages. They limited port size, valve size, and compression ratio, all specifically targeting the Cleveland. It worked. Ford withdrew from Trans-Am. Secret number 12. NASCAR was equally afraid of the Cleveland. In 1971, Ford teams started showing up with Clevelands instead of the old 427 FE engines. The first race with Cleveland power? A Ford finished first, second, and third. By mid-season, Ford had won 15 of 20 races. NASCAR immediately announced restrictor plates for 1972, specifically sized to hurt the Cleveland's high RPM breathing advantage. The Cleveland's racing dominance went beyond just Trans-Am and NASCAR. Secret number 13. In Australian touring car racing, the Cleveland-powered Falcon GTHOs were so dominant they caused a national controversy. The Phase 3 GTHO made 380 horsepower and could hit 170 mph. In 1971, Australian insurance companies refused to cover them. The government threatened to ban them. The planned Phase 4 with 430 horsepower was killed before production. The Sydney Morning Herald ran a front-page story titled, "160 mph supercars, madness?" Ford Australia pulled out of racing entirely. Let's talk about secret number 14. The Cleveland's failure modes were spectacular and predictable. The number 2 connecting rod bearing would fail first, always. Why? Ford's engineers had optimized the oiling system for sustained high RPM, not street driving. At idle and low RPM, oil pressure to the number 2 main bearing was marginal. Add some wear, some neglect, maybe the wrong viscosity oil, and boom, spun bearing. But here's the thing. When properly maintained, Cleveland's were incredibly durable. Taxi companies in Australia ran them for 300,000 miles. The key was proper oil pressure and regular changes. The engines that failed were usually hot-rodded by kids who didn't understand that this wasn't your father's FE big block. It needed care. It needed respect. Secret number 15 is about the Cleveland's aftermarket potential. In 1978, 7 years after the last Cleveland was built for the U.S. market, Jack Roush set a Bonneville record with a Cleveland-powered Mustang II. The engine, a distroked 377 cubic inch Cleveland, making 800 horsepower, naturally aspirated. That's 2.12 horsepower per cubic inch. From pushrod technology in the 1970s. The secret was the heads. With porting and larger valves, Cleveland 4V heads could flow 330 CFM, more than most big block heads. The combustion chambers could handle 14.1 compression without detonation thanks to their quench design. The valve train geometry was so good, it could handle cams with over 700-inch lift. No other production Ford engine could do that. Secret number 16. The Cleveland almost became the Corvette engine. This isn't speculation. In 1971, Chevrolet engineers bought a Boss 351 Mustang for evaluation. Their report, which leaked years later, admitted the Cleveland was superior to the LT1 350 in every measurable way except fuel economy. There were serious discussions about licensing Ford's design or developing a response. Instead, Chevrolet went with emissions-friendly small ports for 1972. Ford had built the ultimate performance V8 just as performance became illegal. The Cleveland's compression ratios tell the story of the era. Secret number 17. The 1974 V had 11.01 compression. The Boss 351 ran 11.71 with forged pistons. By 1972, 8.6.1. The same heads, the same displacement, but neutered by low compression and retarded timing. Power dropped from 330 to 266 horsepower. It was like putting a marathon runner in cement shoes. Secret number 18 might be the most painful. Ford had developed a aluminum block Cleveland that weighed just 135 pounds, 90 pounds less than the iron block. It was tested to 650 horsepower and 8,500 RPM. 12 prototypes were built. The plan was to offer it in the 1971 Mustang as the ultimate Boss 351. Then the insurance crisis hit. The program was canceled. All but 2 prototypes were destroyed. Those 2? One's in the Henry Ford Museum. The other was smuggled out by an engineer and sold to a racer in 1985 for $50,000. The Cleveland's end came not with a bang, but a whimper. Secret number 19. The last Cleveland wasn't built in Cleveland. After U.S. production ended in 1974, the tooling was shipped to Australia, where the Cleveland lived on until 1982. The final Clevelands were actually better than the originals. Australian engineers fixed the oiling problems, improved the head gasket design, and strengthened the block casting. These Aussie Clevelands are now worth more than Boss 351 engines to collectors who know. But here's the ultimate secret. Number 20. The Cleveland's DNA lived on. When Ford developed the modular V8 family in the 1990s, they studied the Cleveland extensively. The 4-valve 4.6 and 5.4 modular engines use the same valve angles as the Cleveland. The port design philosophy, controlled turbulence for mixture motion, came straight from the Cleveland playbook. The 2000 Cobra R's 5.4 engine made 385 horsepower from 330 cubic inches, almost exactly what the Boss 351 made from 351 inches 30 years later. The Cleveland story is one of the great what-ifs in automotive history. What if it had arrived in 1968 instead of 1970? What if the insurance crisis hadn't killed performance cars? What if emissions regulations hadn't strangled it? We'll never know. But for one brief shining moment from 1970 to 1971, Ford built the most advanced pushrod V8 ever put in a production car. It was too good for its own good, too powerful for its era, too expensive to build when cheap became the priority. Today, the Cleveland is finally getting its due. Engine builders are making 600 horsepower naturally aspirated with modern technology applied to Ford's 1960s genius. Heads that once couldn't be given away now sell for thousands. Boss 351 Mustangs that couldn't find buyers in 1971 now trade for six figures. The Cleveland has become what it always should have been, a legend, but perhaps the real legacy of the 351 Cleveland isn't the horsepower or the racing wins, it's the philosophy. Ford's engineers didn't just try to one-up the competition. They tried to build the absolute best engine technology allowed. They succeeded so completely that the racing bodies had to change the rules to stop them. The Cleveland wasn't just an engine, it was a statement. Ford could out-engineer anyone when they wanted to. The tragedy is, they only wanted to for about 18 months. But what an 18 months it was. The Cleveland remains the high-water mark of American pushrod V8 development. Everything since has been evolution. The Cleveland was revolution. It was Ford's middle finger to the competition, cast in iron and aluminum, breathing through ports the size of sewer pipes, spinning to RPMs that shouldn't have been possible. That's the real secret of the 351 Cleveland. It wasn't built for the street. It wasn't even built for racing. It was built to prove a point. That Ford's engineers were the best in the world. For a brief moment in 1970 and 1971, nobody could argue otherwise. The Cleveland was proof. 351 cubic inches of fire-breathing, rule-bending, competition-crushing proof. So next time you see a Cleveland at a car show, don't just admire it, respect it. This wasn't just another V8. This was Detroit's last great engineering overreach, a money-no-object exercise in being the best. In an era of compromise and restriction, the Cleveland stood for neither. It was excessive, it was expensive, and it was absolutely magnificent. What's the rarest Cleveland-powered car you've ever seen? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into Ford's most misunderstood engine, hit that subscribe button. Because next week we're talking about another engine that was too good for its own good, the Buick Stage 2 455 that made so much torque it twisted frames. Until then, keep those engines running, and remember, sometimes the best engines are the ones that never got the chance to show what they could really do.